Welcome everybody to AmCham's webinar on the Cambodian Investment Law 2021. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I am Anthony Galliano, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Cambodia. And today we're going to talk about Cambodia's Investment Law 2021. Today's guests with us, I'm really very pleased that we have Dr. Sok Siphana, who's joining us from Singapore. Probably one of the experts on this topic, and it's great really to have him. The webinar will be moderated by Ms. Rina Ang. She is the new board member of the American Chamber of Commerce. Very glad that she's joined the board last month. Jay Cohen is joining us as well. He's also going to present and discuss some of the aspects of the law and how it applies to our members. I wanted just to hope everybody is safe during this very difficult time. We're doing webinars to try to keep engaged with our members, to try to keep informative and educational with topics that are of interest to our membership. It's a tough time for everybody, but we're doing our best to do that. AmCham is doing great. We are very financially strong. We have an increase on membership of about 40% year on year. We now have 7 advocacy committees, and this year is our 25th anniversary. So I hope as the year goes to an end that we're able to see you in person and to celebrate our 25th anniversary, because it's a very important, monumental milestone for us, and we really hope that we could celebrate it with you. I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Rina, who will now start the webinar on Cambodian Investment Law 2021.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for our webinar today. My name is Rina. As Anthony has already presented myself, I just like to turn the time to our speaker, each our speaker, to present, to make a self-introduction. First of all, please, Dr. Sok Siphana.
Well, everybody. Well, I guess everybody knows me now. I mean, Sok Siphana, and I'm the founding partner of SokSiphana&associates. But I also happen to be advising the government on mostly foreign policy in the last 10 years. But in the past, I've been attached to the CDC way back when UNCTAD was just moved, and we moved into that building there. There was no chair, no nothing. So I was privy to be part of the first investment law in '93 when it was drafted. So it's quite a breath of fresh air to be back and talk about the future law investment. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. So Jay, please.
Hi, my name's Jay Cohen. I'm a partner and director of Tilleke Gibbins Cambodia office. I've been here in Cambodia since 2009, working on a wide array of corporate commercial matters. I've done a lot of market entry work for clients. I've also done a lot of advising on a lot of other corporate and commercial practices, everything from banking and finance, energy, TMT, intellectual property. So, over the years, I've seen a lot of changes, especially with the transition from this old previous version of the investment law to the new one. So I'm very excited to talk to you about it today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sok Siphana and Jay. Now we turn the time to Dr. Sok Siphana for his great insight on the investment law and the draft one. Please.
Well, like I say, when the original investment law came in '94, most Cambodians didn't know it applied to them. And that's one thing, because at that time there was no Cambodian private sector. Let's be real about that. 93, 94, emerging country. So when the law came out, most Cambodians say, well, that must be a foreign investment law. I say, no, it didn't say anywhere foreign. So it applied both to Cambodian and foreign. But the point is that the Cambodian private sector was not there yet. So then you see the evolution, so like about 8 or 9 years ago, the economy changed. So we start to amend the law, right? 2001, we amended. At that time, we're in the middle of WTO accession. Again, you have to bear in mind, whenever Cambodia is always looking for trigger point, right? WTO accession is a trigger point. Accession to ASEAN is another trigger point. So these trigger points push the government to think, we have to start, developing, amending the law to reflect the new reality. And now what we see is the same thing, is that after so many years, so you figure out 2001, so almost 20 years, right? Yeah, so it's about that. We start having the pressure to say, okay, now we have COVID from the last 2 years, right? And WTO accession effect is wearing off. ASEAN integration is getting deeper. We have the free trade with China, soon with Korea, and next year we will have the ASEP, which is going to be a major triggering point for Cambodia to start attracting investment, right? And you have the Chinese come in from the Belt and Road Initiative. So all this, and of course, mindful of the Japan. Also, Japan have its own strategy of the free and open Indo-Pacific as well. So all these factor, sort of like push the government to say, look, we have to move, to improve our investment law, to update our investment law, and hopefully this will be the catalyst to attract new investment. Yeah. So that would be my opening remark there.
Okay. So, thank you so much, Doctor, for the overview of the law and the background as well. So now we are moving to Jay for some questions. Thank you so much. So, Jay, before we go to Jay, everyone, if you have any questions, please drop it in in the question box on our Facebook page live. For the question, Jay, as compared to the existing law, what the additional business sector that are likely to qualify for QIP?
That's a good question. So I think when we look at, what are the additional sectors that are covered by the new investment law, if you look at the new investment law, there's a section that talks about, areas that will be prioritized and encouraged. So when you look at that list and you see what are things that are different, I mean, you see things like green energy. You see a reference to SMEs, small and medium enterprises. That was something that was never in the previous law. You also see things about research, development, and innovation. So I think these are really like things that show the direction of the new law. I think it shows that the government really looked at like where Cambodia's economy is moving and decided to include additional sectors. Now with that said, a really key component is something called the negative list. So the way the law of investment works generally is, any investment can qualify so long as it's not on the negative list. And under the old investment law, the negative list had a lot of items that related to like manufacturing, large-scale agriculture, 4 or 5-star hotels, like very large developments. So I think what will be really interesting, and this is what we really need to see, is what is on that negative list. And I think once that comes out, then it'll be even more clear how the Cambodian government has decided to prioritize those encouraged sectors.
Thank you, Jay. Yes, the SME will help Cambodian investor to be able to benefit from the investment, as Doctor has mentioned as well. Thank you. And
yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I think that's what's also great is that, as Dr. Sok Siphana said, like the law doesn't discriminate. So, Cambodians and foreigners both can take advantage of these investment incentives.
Yeah, the thing that I find refreshing is that the rise of the SME, as Jay, you have mentioned, in Cambodia, 99% of the Cambodian enterprise are SME. And well, we have some tycoon, of course. We may have 30, 40, 50 tycoon, okay, at most, right? But they are not representative of the Cambodian economy. It's a small and medium-sized enterprise that need to feed into the supply chain. Because you see, you have to bear in mind that when the ASEP kicks in, right, there'll be a lot of opportunity for SME to enter into the supply chain, so that this way, say for example, if you have an SME who have 30 hectare of rubber plantation. Yeah, okay. So and then let's say there's a big Japanese tire manufacturer coming in. So the local Cambodian company could be part of the supply chain to supply the raw material, or at least semi raw material, to the Japanese company, and then they can export it to the 5 other country, Japan, Australia, whatever, part of the regional supply chain. Because right now it's very low. We have barely 5% of local input, and this is something that I think will be a big boost for small and medium-sized enterprise. Yeah.
so, another question, we move to the second question. What are ways that the incentives in the new investment law is an improvement to the existing incentive?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. And I know I also have some slides on this as well a
Yeah.
little bit later to go through it. But I think one of the things about the previous investment law, you always had like a tax exemption from 3 to 9 years. So that has been retained in the new version of the investment law. So that's terrific. But in addition to that, after your period of tax exemption expires, for an additional 6 years, you can also get a tax exemption as well on a sliding scale. So the way that it works is, after your tax exemption expires for an additional 6 years, for the first 2 years, you would only have to pay 25% of the amount of tax due. For the next 2 years, you would have to pay 50% of the tax due. And then for the final 2 years, you'd have to pay 75% of the tax due. So that means after your tax exemption expires, let's say you owe $100 of tax. For the first 2 years, you'd only have to pay $25. And then for the next 2 years, you don't have to pay $50. For the next 2 years, you don't have to pay $75. So actually, that's a great benefit. That really improves the landscape, I think, for investment incentives. Also, I think when you look at some other things, in terms of some of the investment guarantees, there's also some good benefits there. For example, visas for family members, for minors. That was something that wasn't clear in the old one, so I think that's a nice benefit. That would be more for foreign investors who would need work permits and visas for family members. But yeah, I think that's a really positive change.
Doctor, may we have your insight on those benefits, whether
Yes.
that will be only for the new investment project or it will also be applicable to the existing QIPs that are already operating in Cambodia?
Well, the issue is that, the government will come up with a implementing sub-decree, right? And as Jay mentioned, the devil is always in the detail. And when it comes to tax issue, Anthony, you can agree or you don't agree with me. It's a field of expertise that only tax people, tax people can handle it. And I would not advise, people to just go blindly for that, right? Hire good tax people to advise you, because the devil is always in the detail. And I can tell you, the only sure thing that will happen in our lifetime is tax and debt. And I said, like, for last 10 to 15 years, I say, guys, enjoy what you have now, because as the year go by, the tax is getting more and more complicated. And let's face it, Anthony, 20 years ago, we can do most of the stuff ourselves. Now forget about it. Even me, when I start reading all these tax rules, I say, oh my God, I better leave to the tax people, because the complexity of this rule are mind-boggling. And again, it's you against the taxman. You say, well, I'm qualified for this, but the taxman say, well, I'm not so sure because this. So anyway, what I'm saying here is that for the government side, it's a balancing test. On one side, they try to balance revenue for the state. At the same time, they try to balance also the benefit for the investor. Because bear in mind that now custom revenue is coming down very fast. With all this free trade, revenue from custom is very negligible. 20 years ago, before we joined WTO, custom revenue was very high, tax is very low. Then you start to see that, and now tax revenue is here, custom revenue is here, because under the ASEAN free trade, under the China-Cambodia free trade, soon the Korean free trade, the ASEP, the custom revenue, most of the items are zero. So where is the revenue coming? It's from tax and excise, right? So I really advise, a member here to well, maybe I promote Anthony a bit
Yes.
to reach to reach tax people. I mean, it could be the FDL, it could be KPMG, whatever, but you must have a tax specialist, and that it's a must, because if not, you'll be hit back. Because bear in mind also, we start to have also the double taxation with Singapore, with Thailand, with China, with Japan, and these are all benefit if you can, have the right advice. You have the right advice, yeah.
Just make one. Thank you, Dr. Siphana, and appreciate the perspective that tax is complex and difficult, so it makes us all able to make a living. But I would say one thing I'm encouraged about is the fact that the sliding scale of tax incentives is actually competitive regionally. As you know, in Singapore, this was a concept also of having a sliding scale of tax incentives over a 3-year period as well, if you set up a Singapore company. So I think we have seen encouraged, I guess, the tax department, encouraged the government to be competitive with tax incentives around the region or around the world. And this, I think, is a very positive step to actually have these long-term tax incentives for major projects. And that I think it also encourages investors to pay tax because they get the tax incentive and they're not discouraged by paying high taxes in the 20% range. These are actually a very reduced scale, and it encourages investors actually to pay their tax. So it's a very positive step and competitive regionally, which I'm very happy to see.
Encouraging.
Yeah.
Okay, still about the tax because the incentive is mostly about tax. Okay. Okay.
Well, I'll say this is sort of like second what Dr. Siphana was saying. You know, in the new law of investment, there's a lot of references to the law of financial, like laws of financial management. So basically, like in the draft law, it acknowledges that there will be future regulations coming out. The law of financial management often amends the tax laws. So I think we'll definitely have to look to see how some of these tax laws are amended in the future.
Well, let me add this to Jay, right? The annual financial law is basically an annual law that I would say the government is looking for what are the issue that year, right? So take, for example, the COVID case, the last 2 years, right? They come up with various measures to support, but it's from the annual financial law. And but to me, I want to say it's a bit worrisome in the sense that you don't know what will be in that annual financial law, right? So that is one issue that I want to caution that the investment law as it stands is only like 43 some article. It's basically a framework agreement. It's a framework agreement. It's only so much you can analyze from that 12 chapter. The detail is in the annual financial law, right? And that's where we have to be following up all the time. And between you and me, we don't have time to go and read at the end of the year the annual financial law, and that's where Anthony's job is to monitor what's happening in the end of the year, what new regulation, what new prakas, what new incentive or non-incentive it's going to be taking place.
Yes, so Doctor, may you provide us with some estimated time frame for the adoption of the law and the sub-decree implementing the law on investment, so that may also play a role in all the tax part as well, or clarification?
I suspect, by the end of the year, the law will be pushed through Parliament when the Parliament reconvene. Yeah, so I'm quite optimistic. And right afterward, I hope that the sub-decree will come out and the annual financial law will have to be adopted by the end of the year. It's part of our budget law, So between the two, I suspect that early next year it should be operational. Yeah.
Thank you. So you have any questions regarding this?
If I could have a question, Dr. Siphana, how do you feel that the potential new adoptions will make us more competitive for investors in the region, as opposed to our neighboring competitors, Vietnam, Thailand, now Laos? How does this help us to be more competitive as a country?
Well, okay. The big trigger point will be the ASEP, okay? The ASEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's only second to the WTO, and it's a mega free trade between ASEAN country and so China, Japan, Korea, Republic Korea, Australia, New Zealand, right? So ASEP will be the main driving force, because from there most of the economic activity, the relocation of industry, the moving of the industry will be all around that because they're looking to say, where do we tap the next source of growth? How do we move our industry to take advantage of the rural origin, for example, right? Because, say, for example, many Chinese company will be coming to Cambodia under the ASEP because now they have access to the US, for example, not as Chinese company, but as Cambodian company with the US China tension, for example, right? And there could be also some company moving, Taiwanese company could be moving to Cambodia because Taiwan is not part of the ASEP, right? So ASEP is a big game, right? So Taiwanese company could come to Cambodia, put everything together, and then ship to Japan, ship to China under a ASEP, framework agreement. So I think, and that's why you see in a lot of this incentive, is all about giving incentive to this new industry, right? Research and development for sure, right? What else sort of like the fourth industrial revolution, all this technology, it's all part of this new trend, and that's why I think for me, I would put all my money on to implement the ASEP. Yeah, it's a lot of trade diversion. A lot of trade diversion. Yeah.
Do you have a presentation? A presentation?
Have any questions? Okay, so thank you. We are moving to the next question, still about tax. So, yes, because the incentive are pretty much tax incentive and some investment incentive. So, this question I think will be for Jay. So, would the investor be able to receive dividend during the tax holiday without having to pay any tax, free of tax?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rina. And let me just say, under the old investment law, there was always a tax exemption, and under the current one, there's a tax exemption as well. But previously, before they amended the tax rules, you had this tax exemption, but it was never quite as good as it looked, because as soon as you tried to pay a dividend, then there was a special tax that applied. And that special tax was, at first, 20%, which was exactly the same as a corporate tax. And then, of course, you had withholding taxes if you were paying a dividend to a non-resident. So you got this tax exemption, but if you really tried to take money out of the company, you basically lost the benefit of that tax exemption. Starting in 2020, they amended the tax rules. So then when you paid a dividend, you no longer had to pay that 20% penalty on funds that were being used to pay the dividend. So actually, suddenly it really became a true tax exemption starting in 2020. But you still have to pay withholding tax on dividends to non-residents. So to answer your question directly, if you have a QIP and you pay a dividend to a non-resident, you still have to pay the 14% withholding tax, but you no longer have to pay that 20% penalty, basically. So in that sense, yes, there is a real benefit. You really do get a tax exemption. There's a 14% withholding tax if you're paying to a non-resident. However, if you're a Cambodian resident, then you wouldn't have to pay that withholding tax. So then that would be even more tax efficient.
Fantastic.
There's also the double taxation that will kick in also, that will bring down to 10%, no?
That's a good point. So if there's any avoided double taxation agreements between Cambodia and other countries, that could reduce the withholding tax on those dividend payments. So that's a very good point.
So the dividend, the free tax on the dividend during tax holiday, is it addressed in the draft law or how it's played, Jay?
No, so it's not addressed in the law. So the way, the law of investment, it sets out all of the tax exemptions. But then, you really need to look at the tax laws, and then there's the law on financial management, which tweaks the tax laws. So in that sense, when you just read, and I think for many investors, if you only read the law of investment and you stop there, you don't fully appreciate how the law of investment interacts with the tax laws. And that was exactly Dr. Siphana's point. You really have to dig into the tax laws as well. A lot of details are there as well. So where the law of investment is a great framework, and I think it really shows, it does provide some really valuable incentives. You do have to look beyond it. You do have to look at the tax laws and see how that interacts with the law.
have any question regarding the dividend?
I think the point being that Dr. Siphana mentioned on the double taxation treaties, which the General Department of Taxation is accelerating over the years. So that will be a benefit, again, a reduction in the withholding tax on dividends on most ASEAN countries, I would believe at this point.
Yeah, and that also leads, I think, towards like structuring it. So I think if you're like an investor and you're looking at coming into the Cambodian market, that goes to like structuring considerations. Like if you want to like invest through a holding company, or if you have like a base in one country that has a avoidance of double taxation agreement with Cambodia, then it'd be more preferential to start your investment from there as opposed to some other country.
I think now we have double taxation with Singapore, with China, with Japan, with Korea, and a few other countries. I think 8 countries. Yeah, and 2 more will be enter into force next year or so. So it's about 10 years.
I mean, perhaps, Anthony, you can start working on the U.S.-Cambodia avoidance of double taxation treaty.
Well, I think with the U.S. now being the largest export market for Cambodia, we have to really start thinking about that. You know, how we could take advantage of encouraging U.S. investors actually to come here and doing more production here. So I guess that would be my question. We are the American Chamber of Commerce, and we're really keen to see more U.S. investment, more U.S. Interest in investing in the country, whether it's manufacturing, real estate. We're seeing a lot of tech and digital investment coming into the country. That could be done from far away rather than having tangible offices here. So how would the investment law in general encourage U.S. investors to come here and actually put a footprint here? Because that's probably what we're lacking with some of these companies that we have that are big players in Cambodia. I mean, Facebook is a huge player. Amazon's a player. Disney is just coming in with their streaming service. But a lot of these companies really don't have a footprint here. How do we encourage, through these investment laws, to have these big digital tech companies come in and put a footprint here?
Well, you know, okay, before I answer that, I want to say that the GSP, you know, the extension is on, you know, so I think Congress, the U.S. Congress is working on that, so they will extend, I think, it's supposed to be 6 years, but I think they're going to do only 4 years for now, yeah. But that will keep our garment and footwear and the upper in the travel bag, you know, industry afloat, right? So that I would say that's our main business with the U.S. because from my perspective, Cambodia look at the U.S. more for market access, European also for market access, for this garment, footwear, and travel good. China is now start to see agriculture, right? Because agriculture is heavy. So the closer the destination, the better, right? And you have to bear in mind with the COVID, the shipment container price have gone up 10 times. 10 times. What used to cost $2,000 or $3,000 per 40-foot container now go to $30,000-$40,000. So it's quite worrisome, the trend of the global supply chain there, right? But again, I would say Cambodia economy is basically looking at these 3 major markets for differentiated export. Unfortunately, Anthony, your hope to attract big American company to Cambodia, it's a bit difficult because I'm in Singapore, okay? And I can tell you, Singapore is the hub. Singapore is the hub of all the multinational in the region. And from there, from Singapore hub, they will expand to Cambodia, to Laos, to whatever, right? But it's like a shipment. The ship that leave Sihanoukville go to Singapore, you know, for the mothership. We have a feeder. We are only a feeder port. So from this investment perspective, I think we have market access. I'm happy. Because, for example, you know, big company who are established in Singapore, they will have no incentive to come to Cambodia because the market is so small right? And the reach into the local market, it is negligible in terms of global market access, right? So I think if we can keep just this market access for travel good, for GSP, I'm happy. I'm happy.
I really want to compete with Thailand. I'd like to see some more manufacturing here. If you look at the southern belt of Thailand, there's a lot of international companies. There's a lot of American companies who are doing manufacturing in Thailand. I think the excuse in the past has been infrastructure, but that was I believe, that's no longer really a valid excuse. Cambodia has really improved its electricity, its roads. Great job by the Ministry of Transport to get and continuing to do a great job to improve our infrastructure. So now that we have changed the dynamic over the years of having the infrastructure in place, the electricity power in place, although still expensive, there's a way we can do incentives there as well for bringing manufacturing. I think Cambodia still can attract more manufacturing. We're in a dependence on a sunset industry, which is the garment industry. It's always been called the sunset industry, and it's a very competitive, low-margin business. Manufacturing of cars, we're doing obviously bicycles and motorbikes now, but we need to really upscale that. Is the investment law considering that now and in the future, that how we can actually compete with Thailand, with this being a big manufacturing hub?
Well, the list of the sector that are under covered for incentive are there. Anything to do with the fourth industrial revolution, e-commerce, electronics, all these things are part of the future, and smaller, high value, and this is where I think it will cover. So I think in the future, uh, if you are able to attract, I would say, American company based in Singapore, no need to go to America, no need to go. So there are 3,000 multinational in Singapore already. If you're going to lead a trade delegation, come to Singapore and ask them to just shift some of their operation. And let's face it, there are a big opportunity to divert from Myanmar. From Myanmar, you can operation that just been closed down in Myanmar, they can relocate to Cambodia. Yes.
Okay, so um, to benefit from, sorry, before we go to the registration process, so regarding the incentive, is there any other incentive, investment incentive besides tax for a company to be a QIP under the new draft law?
There are some other incentives as well. So they also have like accelerated. So you actually, when we look at the incentives, there's actually two packages you can choose from. One package is tax exemptions. The other one is accelerated depreciation. So you actually have a choice between the two, tax exemptions or accelerated depreciation. You also get some other benefits for the prepayment of profit tax, for the minimum tax. You get an exemption during the period of time that you have the profit tax exemption or the accelerated depreciation exemption. So you get that as well. You also get write-offs for certain kinds of expenses. So if you have expenses for training Cambodian workers, in addition to the cost, you either get 150 or 200% write-off. So actually it really encourages you to spend money in ways that benefit the Cambodian economy, that benefit the Cambodian workforce. You also can get these advanced write-offs for that as well. So I think that's actually something really positive as well.
Yes. Um,
What Jay mentioned just now, it's the other part, policy aspect that this investment law is focusing. Is the government starting to say, wait a minute, we got to care for our worker, better, more dignified living, and that's why we give this allowance, 150% allowance for cost for nursery, for a better catering facility, for better transport. I mean, you and I see already when we drive to pass the airport, along this road full of garment industry, you see how a Cambodian worker are piled up in this van, you know, at the end of the day, go home in the morning, come back to work. They all like stuff like, I mean, I don't want to say the word inhumane, but I think it's about time that the government now to say, okay, we will give incentive for you guys to have a better transport, right? You know, for that, better eating facility, for example. And I think the Japanese are leading that. To be fair to the Japanese don't pay more than the Chinese, but they provide better, more dignified working environment. You know, a good catering place, a good infirmary, a good, I would say, working condition. People wearing, particularly in the electronic thing, they're wearing gloves, that sort of thing. And I think these are a good sign, right? And upskilling the worker is definitely part of that aspect also, because you probably heard me say 20 years ago, I say, we don't want to be working in the garment industry forever. We don't want to be. But right now we have to, because you have no, it's a gradual process to graduation. But at some point, we have to move up the value chain. We have to move up the quality chain. And that's what this law is all about, is to enable more value addition into that, right? Yeah.
Doctor, thank you. And Doctor, regarding the draft law, in what way it may have to improve the research and capacity building for the local staff in the investment company?
Yeah, so basically, if they spend, because let's face it, up to now, very few company invest in R&D. Very few, because they are just a satellite of operation of another company. We just produce, right? But this new incentive will push company to say, okay, if we say, for example, in the fintech, say, for example, in the startup, right? There's a lot of component on research, right? So if they spend money on research and development, they could write off most 150% of their costs. But it's a good start. I don't think that, you know, immediately company will rush in to start the R&D here, but over time you will start seeing the effect of this policy aspect of it. You know, and I take, for example, in say in the agriculture, that's where you will see immediate tangible benefit. For example, research and development on how to preserve better mango, banana to export to other country, because these are perishable goods. So it required incentive for them to research what are good, sort of like gene for banana, for example. I don't know. I'm just saying, right? But all these things have an impact on the motivation of CEO who are running company in Cambodia. Yeah. And agriculture is for sure an area that would benefit tremendously from this R&D, you know, for that. Yeah.
Okay, so Jay, is there any investment guarantee under the draft law comparing, and what are them comparing to the investment guarantee under the existing investment law?
Okay, so the new investment law, like the older investment law, has like a number of like investment guarantees, and you have like, and they're generally very broad. I mean, one, they have things like non-discrimination for foreign investors, and actually I think that's actually one of the great things about Cambodia is that it doesn't discriminate against foreign investors. One little asterisk, obviously foreigners can't own land, but that aside, foreign investors and Cambodian investors are treated the same under the law. And that's actually something I tell a lot of foreign investors, like Cambodia is really the easy place to do business, especially when you look at the neighbors like Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar. Aside from that, you have other things, other sorts of general guarantees. The government won't fix pricing, guarantees against expropriation. If there has to be like fair compensation. So you get some like very general, like high-level benefits, and these are very much the same as the existing law of investment. The one thing I want to highlight, though, is there are some, I think, benefits on work permits and visas for foreign employees. And this is something, the previous version of the investment law did grant work permits for people working for QIPs, and it allowed QIPs to hire foreigners. This goes just a little bit further. Like it clarifies that for foreign employees, for their spouses and their children's, they can also get like long-term residence visas. And I just think that's a benefit. Although it's always easy, relatively easy for spouses and children to get those longer visas, I think the framework was a little bit like ambiguous, but now it's more clear. So I think it just makes it a little bit easier to bring expats into Cambodia, to bring their families and children. There's a little bit more guarantee that there's going to be a long-term visa for them as well.
I guess I'll ask a simple question. If I'm listening in now and I'm overseas and I want to invest in Cambodia, I think the QIP process for some may be a little bit more complicated than we're actually making it. So what is the criteria if somebody listening in now and I have a pool of investment that I want to come here and do an investment, what do I have to do to take advantage of these investment incentives? And what's the process to do it?
So they've changed the process a little bit. So again, if you want to seek for investment incentives, you have to apply either through the Council for Development of Cambodia, or you also have provincial municipal investment subcommittees. So, and that depends upon the size of your investment. So you'll have to look to see for some of the new regulations to just clarify, are you applying at the CDC or at these provincial municipal investment subcommittees? But either way, there's basically, you have to submit an application and supporting documents. In terms of the process, once the application is released, you have to do supporting documents that talk about the size of your investment, the number of employees you want to hire, land use, business plans, environmental management, things like that. You submit that to the CDC, and then under the new law, the time frame is supposed to be 20 days, where they issue you a registration certificate.
Yeah.
So actually, it should be a pretty efficient process to submit and to get those incentives.
And people are going to ask, what is the minimum sort of investment that you'd be looking at to do it's a QIP, correct?
So that's, I think, really the hot question. So under the current law of investment, if you looked at the negative list, so the negative list really set the thresholds. And they would say things like, if you want to set up a factory, you can always set up a factory, but if you want a QIP, the minimum investment has to be, say, $2 million. So that's where you really need the negative list to let us know what are those minimum thresholds. And what's so interesting about the law of investment is when you look at the encouraged areas, they did mention SMEs in priority sectors. So that actually seems to suggest for some sectors, at least the thresholds might be relatively low where an SME could hit it.
$2 million, I think, for some SMEs may be a little high as an initial investment.
Well, absolutely, and that's where, under the law of investment, they need to reissue the negative list, and they say that they will. So it's hard to speculate exactly what that dollar amount will be. I'll just say under the current law of investment, the thresholds are generally around, I think, 300,000 at the low end, up to maybe 2 million. So I think we really need to see, and that's where Dr. Sok Siphana was very clear. The devil's in the details.
Yeah.
So you have this new law of investment, but you really need to see the negative list to understand where those thresholds are. But because they reference SMEs, I'm a little bit optimistic that those thresholds will be reduced.
And the capital requirement, is it have to come in immediate, or is it just deposit and withdrawal? See, because it's a little tricky sometimes with the ministries how they expect you to inject capital over time.
So it's not clear in the new law of investment. They don't specifically address that. But previously, for a QIP, you actually had to bring in, I think, at least half initially. So there was more requirements to actually bring in that capital and then to evidence that. Where typically if you set up a company in Cambodia, you don't have the Ministry of Commerce or the General Department of Taxation looking over your shoulder to really check to see if you've brought in that capital. But there were more requirements for the QIP process.
And of course, the really difficult question is it costly to become a QIP through the CDC? To register a company in Cambodia now is pretty cheap. The government charges are just $500, right? There's always obviously agent charges or legal charges as well, but the receipt from the MOC and the GDT is about $500. How much are we looking at if you really want these tax incentives and investment incentives? How much are we looking at if it goes through the CDC?
That's a really good question. I would have to look to see what their schedule of charges are in terms of what are the official filing fees. But again, I would really sort of encourage everybody. I think if you submit anything to the government authorities, I would encourage people to pay the official fees and to sort of push through that process. And then that's what I think you'll pay. So I think we'll have to like look at the fee schedules to see like what are ultimately the charges and the costs involved.
But I think 20 days is very encouraging. It's now on, I believe it's on the online business registration system
it
that you
is.
could go through to apply for QIP as well. So I hope the cost came down a little bit because that has been a little bit of a disincentive to go through this EDC.
Well, that I can imagine. I think hopefully, again, hopefully everybody will adhere to like the fee schedules and yeah, that'll be the cost.
I mean, that's what the legal profession's here for, to guide people through this. And,
Absolutely.
you know, so that's important. But you at least like have seen that the process has gotten better for sure, and the fees have reduced in terms of the government fees.
Okay, well that's very positive then.
Yes. Doctor, in terms of policy for SME, could you please share with us whether to apply for QIP, SME shall go to the CDC or the provincial and municipal subcommittee, or it depends on the industry? It doesn't matter if it is a SME or not.
Well, like Jed said early, the devil is in the detail, right? Of course, the level of the threshold is very important because at a certain level, I think in the old law is like 2 million. You go to the provincial, so like municipal, provincial administration, and above that you come to the central, which is Phnom Penh, right? I'm pretty sure for the SME, the threshold will be much lower, right? Definitely, because SME by default are local, are Cambodian. You know, I don't foresee an American company coming as SME. I don't foresee that, right? Maybe for Frenchmen, because we have a lot of French coming to simply settle their small business. But I would say, not joking about this, but for American company, this criteria would not qualify because if they come, they be big, right? So SME by default is local company, and you know, even if you look at the stock market, the stock exchange, right? We even come up with special regulation to qualify the SME at some point enter the stock market as well. So I think the future will be more how do the government find way to help SME enter into the stream of commerce, enter in the stream of investment. That's I think that's where the direction is. How they do about it, I think let's face it, in Cambodia, we all go through for last 30 years, and I've been here for 30 years. Many times it's a lot of trial and error because a lot we don't know. A lot of things we don't know. But the good thing is that the government is very open-minded. They listen to private sector. Many times we have clients to say, well, we have this, right? So what do you advise? I say, look, man, this is Cambodia. This is not London. Don't send me a list of stuff that apply to your company in London because Cambodia, we're still quite young. Only the tax regulation is getting worse. It's getting more. But aside from that, you will find many different fields were very simplistic, very simplistic. So I don't foresee sophisticated aspect of that, right? But again, SME is the future of Cambodia. And how the government learn along the way to help. And I take, for example, in SME, you have the Khmer Enterprise now. Khmer Enterprise is supported by the Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance is injecting capital to stimulate some of this enterprise, right? But again, it's a trial and error. The fintech is the same thing. The startup, the same thing. You have the Decho, startup center, right? They are helping company to start the business, but again, it takes time because it's a trial and error. It's trial and error. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have some questions. Thank you to our speakers. It looks like we have some questions, so we shall start our Q&A session.
While we're waiting, just a quick one. Looking into the future, Cambodian Investment Law 2022, 23, 24, 25, You've done such great work with being, for the government with ASEAN. So what countries do you see we can possibly emulate with some incentives that we don't have today? That would be good to look at future law embracing them.
I think boldly we should look at Singapore because let's face it, right? I'm here for a year now. Of course, on medical thing, but I observe what went right in Singapore. Why they're able to attract 3 or 4 thousand multinational to come here? Why? So it's a lot of small thing, but everything work here. Everything work. So the international school we have in Cambodia, okay, we have good international school in Cambodia, okay, medical facility we have now, we start to have some good medical facility in Cambodia. Uh, Shopping we start to have now. IT we start to roll out 4G, eventually 5G, uh, and so I think Cambodia is slowly, catching up the wave, slowly, because we're putting the infrastructure in place to entice company to relocate, right? Because at the end of the day, who decide what country to go? It's not the big CEO in Washington D.C. It's the mid-level guy to say, look, if I go to a country, would my kid have a good school to go? Would my wife have a shopping to hang around, right? So so these are the consideration, and Cambodia start to have all these things in place now. So I think if we can, to me, my strategy way back when I was in commerce was that if we can get 20% of the company who are established in Singapore to just come to Cambodia, 20% is good enough. Because the top end, we can never get it because they're so sophisticated. But the lower end, right? If we can get 20%, I think we're doing well. We're doing well.
Okay, so the first question is for the QIP that is already operating in Cambodia, if it decide to expand the business, whether the expansion project may qualify for the incentive under the new draft law. Jay, I think for you.
So the answer to that question is yes. I mean, the new draft law does talk about like expansion of QIPs, and the investment law does clarify that existing QIPs will fall under the new law. Now, I think the question is like, how is that actually going to work? So, again, the new law of investment sets out like a general framework. It does reference expansion of existing QIPs. So that's why I say to your question, yes, it's covered. But as to any sort of details, like what does a new project have to cover? What is the size of the new project? What's the scope of the new project? What's the application process? That's a little bit uncertain. But I'll just say, in principle, I will say yes, it should be covered under the new law of investment.
The next question is regarding the policy. Can the government put in place a tax benefit for companies that invest in local, building capacity for locals rather than bringing foreign workers in? Okay.
For what?
Can the
Foreign.
Cambodia government put in place a tax benefit for companies that use local force, use the fund to build capacity for local rather than using foreign workers? Whether the government will put in place any tax benefit for those companies, those QIP companies that focus on using local force?
uh, I don't know what the government intend, but the labor ministry have a certain quota that allow foreign company to bring foreign worker only if there's no Cambodian capable force, right? So that's the existing one. Uh, Under this investment law, we have provision for sort of like tax offset for upskilling worker. So that could be under that angle. That could be under the angle that if they provide capacity building, the training for upscaling the worker to eventually take the job of the foreign, say in the factory, there's foreman, there's a supervisor, that sort of thing. They could write off 150% offset for that. Yeah, I think that could be under that angle. Yeah. Yeah.
Another question is regarding the investment impact assessment for QIP. How the investment impact assessment handle?
You know, that's a really good question. So, you know, for environmental impact assessments, it wasn't directly addressed in the new law of investment. There was a reference. So when you submit your application to register a qualified investment project, you do have to discuss or address like environmental issues. So that was mentioned. But exactly what that means is not clear. So I think we'll need to see some delegated legislation. I mean, generally for environmental impact assessments, though, I would make this comment. I mean, there is a law that does require environmental impact assessments for certain kinds of projects. There's a schedule. So, you know, if you have a QIP and your QIP falls on that list of projects that requires an environmental impact assessment, then certainly you'll need to do an environmental impact assessment. Also, one thing I'll say, and this maybe goes a little bit to that point, you know, in the law of investment, or under the current law of investment, the CDC is supposed to help you get all licenses and permits you require to carry out your business. Under the current draft of the new draft of the law of investment, it's a little bit unclear whether the CDC will actually help you get all licenses and permits to carry out your business. So that might be something that you'll need to get. And if you are doing something that touches on the environment, where you require an environmental impact assessment, it might be possible that you have to go get your own approvals for that. I don't, Dr. Siphana, do you have a view on that?
By default, okay, EIA will easily take you 1 year or 2 years by default, because and that's why not all projects would require an EIA. But if you look at the law on environment, you know, there are sub-decree on the environmental impact assessment. It's for agriculture, for mineral, that sort of thing. But you know, to get an EIA done, it takes 1 or 2 years. It's this thick. It's like it's so technical, you know. So I think it should not apply under normal, say for example, investment thing, right? But I am sure that when it comes to big project that fit under the list of the investment sub-decree, there'll be a requirement there. And again, normally they would not require right away. Normally, so they would approve it, and then pending the, say, a year later on, they have to submit the environment. Because, for example, if they do, say, a project on mining, for example, right? So they may have the approval to start the mining project. And then in the first 2 years, it's all about assessment. It's all about feasibility study. It's all about environmental impact assessment. And then hopefully when it's all this thing done, that's when they actually start the project. Yeah. But it is a sensitive issue, you know. It's a technical issue, and only a few companies can do it. In Cambodia, only a few companies can do it. Yeah.
So another question from our audience, Sochita. How does the investment law promote e-commerce ecosystem in Cambodia, Doctor?
Well, it's under the investment incentive right there. You know, the e-commerce, it's technology, the fintech, all that things is supporting that, right? We have an e-commerce law, and you know, it's something that also it's quite new. We keep seeing new regulation coming out, sub-decree, prakar coming out, how to regulate certain sector, that sort of thing. But I would say this is a sector that will have a lot of traction in the future. Um, Again, how do we, you know, determine what are the incentives for that? It's something else. But there's also the issue of taxation, Anthony. You know, on this because you remember about a few months ago, the G20 came up with this arrangement to tax all the big you know giant you know e-commerce company. I think it was a flat 15% or something like this, right? and eventually Cambodia will have to be part of that also.
I think to the point of that, there were a lot of companies overseas doing business in Cambodia, uh,
Yeah.
and those companies were collecting revenue in Cambodia, but weren't actually being taxed on that revenue, which was, I think, a substantial leakage to the country.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think the application of VAT on these overseas services that are being done in Cambodia, consumed in Cambodia, is going to help the country a lot. And I think it's absolutely it's essential. It should happen. You can't come in the country and do business with Cambodians and be exempt from paying taxes when you have somebody that is in the country doing business and paying taxes. So that's being implemented. It's still in early stages, but those companies that are, particularly online e-commerce companies that are doing business here, uh, will now have to register for tax and charge VAT. And with the need to collect more tax given the situation with the economy, I'm very encouraged by this new law that will help the national coffers.
That's a good point. It's a good point.
Okay. Moving to the next question from Sala. Is there any special tax incentive for renewable energy projects?
So the answer is possibly yes. So when you look at like the sectors in the new law of investment that are encouraged, there's a specific reference to renewable energy. So I think that's a really positive reference. So then again, I think the devil's in the details. We need to look at the negative list and then see exactly how is energy going to be incentivized, or what sort of like projects would qualify for a QIP. I'll also note, when you look at the investment law, when we talked about the investment incentives, there's another category in there that basically says that the Cambodian government, if there's any sort of priority sectors, the Cambodian government can also give incentives for those sorts of priority sectors, even though they're not like otherwise mentioned in the law of investment. So I think it actually gives like a lot of flexibility in the law of investment for the government to, decide that certain areas should get incentives, and then to craft incentives for those specific projects. So it also references another law, financial management. So I think we'll have to see the details, like how that will work. But to answer the question directly, yes, there are. It's referenced in the new law of investment. So I think we just need to see like the details of exactly what kind of projects. Is it going to be, large-scale solar farms, hydro projects, or could there be more like retail? So I know there's like a really like strong interest for industrial users to put solar panels on like the roofs of their factories. Retailer solar, is there going to be any incentives there? It's a little bit uncertain. We're going to have to look to see the negative list to see if those projects will qualify. But I think it's great that the government acknowledges that renewable energy is going to be part of like the mix, and that needs to receive incentives under the law of investment.
Well, the trend in the European country is, and here I'm talking about the European Parliament, the European Commission, are starting to make some voice on companies who are benefiting from the trade preference and not using renewable energy. So I think at some point in the near future, they will start to enforce, the use of renewable energy, and that will force us, to start giving more incentive to company to use renewable energy, because it could be one way of the climate change aspect. You've seen in recent months the catastrophe, the disaster arising from climate change, and I'm quite certain that the EU will start enforcing radically this climate change aspect. So if they start enforce, uh, garment and footwear factory have no choice but to justify, to say that they are using, not all, okay, because not all energy are quality industrial energy, right? Renewable energy only drive a certain aspect, portion of the factory, not the big machine. The big machine, they need fossil fuel. They need the normal fossil fuel energy that we are using every day, right? But the renewable energy can help with the lighting, with the small stuff, right? But at some point, there have to be a mix. have to be an energy mix, right? And then this way, company, garment, footwear can say, look, we have a strategy on zero carbon or at least minimum carbon, something like that, right? But for sure, it would be in there, yeah.
Question from Sambat is the 1% income minimum income tax applicable during the tax holiday for the QIP company under the draft law?
Yeah, so during if you have a tax holiday, or if you've selected the accelerated depreciation, during the term of either one of those benefits, you get an exemption on the minimum tax and the prepayment of profit tax. So that is a good benefit. To avail yourself of those exemptions, there's also a requirement to have audited financial reports. But I think pretty much most QIPs would be required to have audited financial reports anyways, just due to the size and scope of their business.
So moving on to another question from Randy. Are there any different criteria applicable for different sectors? For example, the example that he gave, banking and financial versus real estate or construction. No, so to the question for Jay.
Okay. Okay, so I think when you look at that, let's take the tax exemptions. It says it's from 3 years to 9 years. So one of the questions people often ask is how do you know what you're getting? Are you getting 3 years or are you getting 9 years? Well, you know because there's a separate regulation under the law of financial management typically that will then set out for different kinds of investments in different sectors how much of an exemption you're going to get. So for some investments at a certain threshold, you might get 3 years. If you do a really giant investment in certain sectors, you might get 9 years. So I think as to that question, will different sectors get different incentives? I mean, all the incentives are listed in the law of investment, but depending, the length of your exemption will depend upon your sector and the size of your investment. And then again, as I mentioned, there's a bit of that catch-all that allows the Cambodian government for certain specialized projects to craft different kinds of incentives. So it is possible that certain kinds of projects will get some other incentives that aren't specifically listed in the law of investment today.
Yes, I think we are good with our question from the audience. So Anthony, you have any questions? So okay. We are good for today. Thank you so much to our speaker for your presentation today. And as the draft law has not been promulgated yet, we hope to have a subsequent session after the law is adopted and another one after the implementing sub-decree is issued as well. So thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.